The Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Today, the subcommittee is holding its second hearing in its series on the impacts of oil and gas development, with this morning's focus on water pollution. Under Committee Rule 4F, any opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objections, so ordered. First, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank you for traveling great distances for you to be here with us today. You know, from an early age, we learn that water is one of the most precious resources on the planet. It sustains us, it grows our food, and it's vital for all life on Earth. Without water, we wouldn't have coffee, we wouldn't have tamales. Mr. Gosar and I would greatly suffer. Yes. But it's also, it's both essential to and also threatened by energy development. It's essential because modern fracking requires that for nearly every oil and gas well drilled, millions of gallons of water are mixed with chemicals and then injected underground, where it fractures rock formations and releases the oil and gas trapped within the rock. Water is threatened because virtually every one of these wells will be drilled through a groundwater aquifer. If the well is not constructed properly, this presents opportunities for groundwater to be polluted during drilling, or when the well is producing oil, or when the well is producing gas. Over the years, from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Wyoming and Texas, landowners have challenged oil and gas operators they claim that who have hurt their water supplies through fracking. I look at the panel, and it would have been ideal if we would have had such a witness to share his or her story today. But it was proved too challenging, due in part to the strategy that companies have of negotiating sealed settlements with impacted landowners in exchange for staying silent. But the evidence is clear: fracking has contaminated groundwater. And while not systemic, the potential for widespread pollution demands that Congress act to protect groundwater by strengthening well construction standards, conducting water quality baseline testing, and closing legal loopholes. The argument from the industry that there's not enough evidence fracking has ever contaminated groundwater is a poor excuse, because it's not what we need to do, in the sense that to not take action is worse than it will lead potentially to devastating consequences if, in fact, we do have a collapse of well. We don't have to wait for a catastrophe before we try to reduce the likelihood of one happening in the first place, and that's what this argument says we should do. Perhaps the bigger issue, though, is what's happening above the surface, where spills and wastewater disposal can be just as damaging, if not more so. Produced water, or brine, is a very salty water that naturally exists underground alongside of oil and gas. When spilled, brine renders the soil useless. It kills crops and vegetation. It can destroy affected land for years, and if it's not really properly reclaimed. Each year, oil and gas wells produce 900 billion gallons of produced water, enough to fill 1.3 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. And most of this liquid is collected, stored, and then transported off-site. But in 2014, there were nearly 10,000 leaks of produced water, of oil, or of other materials resulting from oil and gas production sites, for a total of 30 million gallons. North Dakota is one of the states most frequently impacted by brine spills, and over the last decade, residents have seen a sharp increase in spills as oil production in that state has surged. Spilled brine, which also contains high levels of ammonia, lead, and other toxins, have been shown to contaminate streams, wetlands, and have seeped into our groundwater, into the groundwater. But while these sorts of impacts have devastated individuals and communities across the country, the present administration has repealed regulations covering well construction and wastewater storage. In my home state of California, the Trump administration has taken steps that are necessary for them to open up more than 2 million acres of public and private land to oil and gas development that could have a devastating impact upon our water supplies. Given that California is already dealing with a significant amount of water-related issues, there are zero reasons for the Interior Department to further risk these resources, all for the benefit of a few oil and gas companies. Whether it's above or below ground, pollution from oil and gas development has considerable impacts on the water supply that millions of people rely on. Congress should not sit by idly as energy companies try to convince us that there's no need to act. With that, I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, and I now recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his opening statement.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all the witnesses for traveling and making your time here to be here today. Today we're going to discuss how to best safeguard our groundwater and drinking water while promoting safe and responsible development of our domestic oil and gas resources. Now, my colleagues across the aisle assert that oil and gas is a dire threat to our water resources and often cite outdated or debunked science to make a point that has been disproved time and time again. They claim that we need more federal mandates to regulate hydraulic fracturing, that without them, our water resources are at risk. But we know the states are in the best position to regulate these processes, as they are on the front lines of protecting our water and our communities. Each of the states with oil and gas production have robust state regulatory programs to manage responsible oil and gas development within their borders, including our federal lands. Regulators partner with industry to develop and implement proactive regulatory requirements to ensure safe drilling practices and to clean up orphan wells. And the positive results of their works are well documented. My colleagues warn about the perceived dangers of fracturing to drinking water, yet there has not been one single documented case of groundwater contamination associated with hydraulic fracturing in the state of Texas, ever. In fact, countless studies at the state and federal level have debunked this erroneous claim that fracking poses a threat to water resources. The Congress settled this issue in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 based on studies completed by the EPA showing no threat to drinking water sources. The Energy Policy Act excluded hydraulic fracturing from the Safe Drinking Water Act's underground injection control program, except in certain cases involving diesel fuels. Congress left the regulation of fracking to the states, who are in the best position to develop and issue regulations based on specific oil and gas development activity and unique geology of their state. Accordingly, the Trump administration wisely chose to nullify the Obama-era federal fracking rule, which would have imposed unnecessary duplicative requirements for a practice that's already heavily regulated in each individual state and under other applicable federal laws. We have also heard from environmental activists who oppose energy development at all costs, that water produced alongside oil and gas operations cannot safely be recycled or used outside of the oil fields. Yet study after study showed that produced water can safely be used not only for future oil extraction and fracking, but also recycled for irrigation on farmland. Furthermore, thanks to effective state regulations, pipelines are now the safest way to transport oil and gas. In fact, there has been a 92% decrease in the pipeline leaks since 1984 and a 20% reduction in pipeline incidents in just the last 5 years. According to the American Petroleum Institute, pipelines are now averaging a 99.99% safety record. Instead of making a roundabout arguments for more onerous regulatory based on selective science, we should be streamlining the federal regulations that are hampering our ability to construct additional pipelines. The lack of adequate pipeline infrastructure in the Marcellus and Permian basins is hindering our ability to meet the needs of consumers in New England and also deterring our country's exports via ports on the Gulf Coast. If we were able to successfully build out much-needed pipeline infrastructure in the Northeast, for example, states like Massachusetts wouldn't have to rely on LNG from Russia to heat their homes. Interesting. We have an abundance of reliable and affordable energy available to us in the United States and the most stringent environmental and labor standards in the world, protecting our environmental and our workers. Not to mention increased natural gas production, thanks to fracking, is driving emissions reductions in this country and helping us lead the way. The states are in the forefront of this effort, and I look forward to hearing more about how they are promoting energy development and safeguarding our water resources today. I thank the chairman and I yield back.
I will now introduce today's witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Dominic DiGiulio, I hope I pronounced that right, a senior research scientist at PSE Health Energy. Our second witness is Mr. Darrell Peterson, a landowner and a former farmer from North Dakota. Our third witness is Ms. Emily Collins, the executive director and managing attorney at Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services. And our final witness is Mr. John Tintera, the president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. Let me remind the witnesses that they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on, and your time will have expired when the red light comes on. And I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also follow the full panel. I will allow the full panel to testify before questioning any of the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Dr. DiGiulio to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dominic DiGiulio. I'm a senior research scientist at PSE Health Energy, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institute that studies the way that energy production and use impacts public health and the environment. Prior to joining PSE, I was a research associate at Stanford University, where I continue today as a visiting scholar. I retired from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research and Development in 2014 after 34 years of public service. I wish to thank members of the committee for the opportunity to speak today on the issue of impact to groundwater resources from oil and gas development. Groundwater resources are vital to the economic development of the United States and the well-being of its citizens. Groundwater resources are especially important in arid regions of the country experiencing rapid population growth and where climate change is expected to further worsen water demand. I will briefly summarize research conducted by myself and coworkers and the relevance of our research on regulatory rulemaking. In 2016, we published a paper that demonstrated impact to groundwater resources meeting the definition of an underground source of drinking water, or USDW, at the Pavilion, Wyoming field. A USDW is defined as a groundwater resource in EPA's Underground Injection Control Program under the Safe Drinking Water Act. While it was known at the time that hydraulic fracturing and acid stimulation occurs in formations containing groundwater resources, this was the first publication which demonstrated that injection of stimulation fluids into formations containing groundwater resources impacts groundwater resources. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 largely exempted hydraulic fracturing from the Safe Drinking Water Act and essentially stripped federal protection of groundwater resources during well stimulation. Our research indicates that groundwater resources can be impacted by well stimulation, and thus exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act needs to be re-examined. Due to this exemption, definitions of protected groundwater during well stimulation vary from state to state. In 2018, we published a paper that found that in most states, definitions of protected groundwater are either ambiguous or do not protect groundwater resources. We also found that geographically, groundwater resources in the Rocky Mountain states are the most vulnerable to impact as a result of exemption of hydraulic fracturing from the Safe Drinking Water Act. In 2015, we published a paper in which we found that at least 6% of hydraulic fracturing in the United States occurs within 3,000 feet of the surface. Since fractures can propagate as much as 2,000 feet upward, deeper groundwater resources could be impacted by hydraulic fracturing even where it does not occur directly in formations containing groundwater resources. Most states do not require estimation of fracture propagation length to ensure an adequate distance between depths of hydraulic fracturing and groundwater resources. Finally, in California, we are examining the impact of disposal of produced water into unlined produced water ponds. This disposal practice has resulted in groundwater contamination at a number of locations throughout the San Joaquin Valley, a drought-prone area of national significance for agricultural production. This impact is largely a consequence of exemption of oil and gas exploration and development waste from Subtitle C of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Exemption from Subtitle C has resulted in a patchwork of regulations for disposal and management of oil and gas waste in various states that have continued to evolve over time. At present, there is no cradle-to-grave tracking of oil and gas development waste in any state as would be required under Subtitle C of RCRA. In conclusion, exemption from federal regulation and often inadequate state regulation has caused impact to groundwater resources as a result of oil and gas development. At present, this situation can only be remedied by reconsideration of federal exemptions or improved regulation on a state-by-state basis. This testimony has been provided to inform the committee on the need for such action at the federal and state level. Again, I thank the committee for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Dr. DiGiulio. The chair now recognizes Mr. Peterson to testify.
Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee. I sit here today on behalf of the Western Organization of Resource Councils and their member group, the Dakota Resource Council. Both are grassroots-based organizations that work to have local voices heard and advocate for the responsible development of resources. It is a great honor to appear before you to discuss the tremendous damage that oil field produced water, also known as brine, has had and will continue to have on farmers and their land and water resources unless far greater efforts are made to regulate and enforce well maintenance as well as brine transportation and storage. I am from Antler, North Dakota, where my wife Christine and I farmed for more than 40 years and still own our land. We raise livestock and grew crops such as wheat, barley, flax, and soybeans. As farmers, the land is our life as well as our precious asset to provide us with retirement income. It has been heartbreaking to see parts of our farm destroyed by a series of preventable brine spills. Over the past 25 years, there have been over a dozen significant brine spills on our farm at great damage to our crops. At least 5 brine spills were not reported by the liable companies. We made the regulators aware of the spills, but they did not begin to hold the companies accountable until 2010. Brine is a toxic byproduct of crude oil and is worse than oil spill because it does not biodegrade. Brine spills make farmland useless for growing crops. Land that has been tainted by brine and not certified to be contamination-free by independent testing cannot be used to obtain mortgage because lenders are reluctant to extend credit. Christine and I have more than 700 acres of good farmland we can't mortgage because of known and potential brine contamination. Each individual acre is valued at close to $2,000, totaling well over $1 million in lost land value, plus possibly millions more if we decide to remove the brine contamination and have the removal certified. During the 1980s and early 1990s, I worked as a gauger pumper on local wells to supplement my farm income and was hired to service 3 wells leased on my own land. In 1990s, our wells were sold to a different oil company who used their own gauger pumpers. Within 1 week, a brine tank ran over and a large amount of salty brine ran into a wetland located 200 feet from the well site. I complained to the liable oil company's regulators, but very little was done to clean up the spill. In 2012, an attempt was made by one oil company to dig out and replace contaminated soil. After spending an estimated $2 million, the reclamation company declared the cleanup was satisfactory and got regulators to sign off. To this day, that land is still barren and unable to support crops. In 2018, after more spills and costly litigation and testing, we reached a private settlement with one oil company for a long-term remediation of their lease site. I am grateful the current operator has agreed to evaluate and restore our land, which is an ongoing process. I consider myself to be a supporter of responsible oil and gas production and acknowledge the great benefits that oil and gas royalties and employment can bring. But responsible development means protecting the land from the destructive impact of brine spills during transportation through pipelines or in trucks and during filling and emptying of storage tanks. The most important role for regulators to carry out regular inspection and enforce the standards on the books. I have a few recommendations for the subcommittee. First, I want to again stress the importance of adequate well inspections and enforcement. Both the Bureau of Land Management and the state need to be accountable to carry out this part of their mandate. They need to be given the resources to do it. Second, companies should be required to submit a salt water management plan with permit applications. Baseline water testing is also necessary. Third, I would like to suggest the establishment of reclamation fee and related fund so the landowner and taxpayers are not forced to bear the cost. Finally, the stronger standards are needed for wastewater systems to prevent brine spills and leaks. The BLM has a large role in place in the creation of strong regulations and enforcement. Both BLM and state regulators must put more emphasis on damage brine spills have on our rural economy and environment, and put rules in place to protect farmers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. It would be an honor to give any interested subcommittee members a tour of brine-damaged lands in North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I now recognize Ms. Collins for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Chairman and committee members. My name is Emily Collins. I'm from the Allegheny Plateau region of Ohio, and I founded and now serve as the executive director and managing attorney of Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services, which is a nonprofit law firm serving modest means clients and teaching young attorneys to do the same. Our mission is to address the vast need for environmental legal services in the Appalachian Basin through outreach, community empowerment, representation, and education. Since starting up in 2014 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Akron, Ohio, our oil and gas cases have comprised between 33 and 42% of our docket. Those cases that deal with water resources impacts number around 45 total since startup. Those cases involve the contamination of underground sources of drinking water, health impacts, property damage, and natural resources damage from wastewater spread on roads to control dust and de-ice, injection of wastewater in communities reliant on water wells, the storage and discharge of shale gas wastewater affecting our clients' health, property, and use of public natural resources, and spills, leaks, erosion and sedimentation, and large-scale water withdrawals affecting people's property and publicly accessible waterways. While I cannot review all 45 cases for you in my time, I can give you a sense of who these people with water-related injuries from shale gas development are. They exist mostly in rural districts that definitively voted Republican in the last major election cycle. They are not environmentalists. They are people with an environmental problem largely caused by a lack of governmental investigation of the site-specific geologic characteristics of the areas being developed and under-resourced local jurisdictions left with decision-making authority over how to properly manage shale gas wastewater. My clients call my firm because they're facing an industry and their own government, two Goliaths, who both claim that the changes in water quality and even quantity is a fragment of their imagination, even though they and their family has lived in the same place for generations. The reality of my clients' stories related to shale gas development is that the harm and damage they have experienced could have been prevented by a practical federal floor that requires states to review gas development permit applications in the same way as any other underground injection that may endanger underground sources of drinking water. The regular permit application review and ongoing monitoring process could prevent problems that have led to such a high number of cases filling our docket. Only one state, Illinois, currently reviews the same amount of data from hydraulic fracturing operations as the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act would require if oil and gas wells were not exempt from permitting under that act. And the spraying of oil and gas wastewater with the characteristics and wild variations that I'm displaying on the slides above, these are just for select pollutants, chloride and radionuclides, that I've gathered from the Clean Water Act permit applications that we've seen in Pennsylvania to treat and discharge shale gas wastewater. This spraying that happens cannot be left as it currently is to under-resourced townships and counties to manage. With reports from our clients ranging from road spreading of oily, sludge-like substances to sheets of brine with very high chloride levels, as you can see in these slides, with the capability to change aquatic ecosystems, Congress is merely inviting impacted landowners to file citizen suits under the Clean Water Act and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act for discharges without a permit and open dumping. Congress is asking citizens to sue the under-resourced local governments that it left without a federal floor to prevent such risks. So the risk, by not having a federal floor, is now on local jurisdictions. With that, I'll say thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to tell our clients' stories from the Appalachian Basin, and I'm looking forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Ms. Collins. And now I recognize Mr. Tintera for 5 minutes of testimony.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, my name is John Tintera. I'm president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. It's a distinct honor and pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. I'm also a former regulator. I served for 22 years on the state agency that oversees the oil and gas industry in Texas, retired in 2012 as their executive director. I'm here to bring a story about Texas and to share what we consider a very strong success story of regulatory oversight in Texas. Good regulations are built on 3 fundamental principles: science, fact, and due process. As scientific knowledge expands and new facts are uncovered, it's important that the due process employed by the regulators in drafting rules keep pace with the technology and operations of the industry that they regulate. This has occurred in Texas. Now, politics is an obvious part of government policy, which should be not part of regulations. Remember, many regulators serve in a quasi-judicial fashion, and when you are in front of a regulatory body and they are assigning fines or making determinations, you certainly want to make sure it's based on objective science, facts, and due process. It should be a grave concern to lawmakers and citizens if politics does intrude into the regulatory process. Under-regulation creates potential risk to public safety and the environment, and over-regulation will damage economies and livelihoods. Skillful regulators should follow what we call the Goldilocks rule principle: not too big, not too small, but just right. In the regulatory world, words matter. The words are crafted by lawmakers and codified by regulators. They're the first tools of how you implement policy. There's a lot more that regulators must do besides craft rules, though, but let me start with some Texas-sized facts. The previous introductory comment was correct. There has not been a single documented groundwater contamination case associated with the process of hydraulic fracturing in Texas. The fact becomes more impressive when you recognize the volume of Texas oil and gas production: more than 1.5 billion barrels of crude oil produced in Texas 2018, 8.9 trillion cubic feet of gas, 5 million barrels per day currently being produced, and over 40% of the U.S. national crude production coming from Texas. How has Texas compiled this strong track record? It has a comprehensive state oil field regulatory framework. It's well-funded by the state legislature. It has modern and updated regulations and competently administered by accountable state regulators. From SPUD to plug, state regulations are designed to protect water above and below the ground surface. There's been over 1 million wells drilled in Texas in the past 120 years. Today, there are 185,000 producing oil wells and 90,000 producing gas wells. The Texas rig count is currently at 485 rigs running, drilling new wells, up from 484 last week, down from 515 1 year ago. To keep pace with this intense level of activity, Texas maintains hundreds of oil field inspectors. These are state employees that are located in oil field centers and work in decentralized management concept where field personnel called outriders work remotely from the district offices, receive their daily assignments, and have comprehensive data internet access with them in the field. A lot less windshield time, a lot more on-the-lease inspection time. But it takes more than logistics to ensure the protection of surface and subsurface water. As directional drilling began to dominate the Texas oil field landscape, hydraulic fracturing became commonplace. Texas regulations have served the state well. There's been many regulations designed to protect the environment. I've included 13 of them in my written testimony. Some are new, some have been updated, others have a value that has stood the test of time. Water protection in Texas has two key statutory definitions in the oil field. The first is pollution of surface or subsurface waters. It's located in the testimony, but it's the alteration of the physical, thermal, chemical, biological quality or contamination of any surface or subsurface water of the state that renders the water harmful, detrimental, injurious to humans, animal life, vegetation, or property, or to public health, safety, or the welfare, or impairs the usefulness of public enjoyment. What is surface and subsurface waters? Well, it's virtually everything. Groundwater, percolating or otherwise, lakes, bay, marshes, shorelines, rivers, streams, etc. In Texas, regulations forbid oil field production above and below, that forbid oil field pollution above and of the groundwater above and below the surface. The statute clearly says, and the regulations say, no pollution. No person conducting activities subject to regulation by the Commission may cause or allow pollution of surface or subsurface waters of the state. A comprehensive regulatory framework has been built around these fundamental water protection rules and regulations. I hope I can help the committee understand today the commitment Texas has to these pollution prevention regulations. The 13 regulations cited have essentially addressed all the water protection concerns that could be presented to regulators by the oil and gas industry. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. And now I want to thank all the members of the panel for their testimony. I want to remind the members behind the dais that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may want to ask to any of the witnesses. And at first, I recognize Representative Huffman.
Well, thank you,
5
Mr.
minutes of
Chairman.
questions.
Thank you very much for this important hearing. The state of California has experienced firsthand the dangers of oil and gas development negatively impacting our groundwater, our freshwater groundwater resources. We've seen what happens when we fail to regulate industry, despite our efforts to move beyond fossil fuel extraction. California is actually a big oil and gas state. We are the fourth largest producer of crude in the country. Nearly 1/3 of the nation's total of oil field injection wells, injecting hundreds of billions of gallons of water a year, are in California. For decades, California oil companies were allowed to dispose of wastewater by simply pumping it into aquifers that were supposed to be protected by federal law. Under a federal delegation of authority to the state's Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources, this is an agency with the strange acronym DOGGR, companies were allowed to inject wastewater without proper review, which unfortunately wasn't revealed until a few years ago through EPA audits of the program. The results of audits between 2011 and 2014 show the extent of water pollution. State officials mistakenly gave permits to more than 6,000 wastewater injection wells in protected aquifers. Federal law allows disposal of wastewater into groundwater when the aquifer is too salty to be a potential drinking water supply, or when it's tainted by chemicals like arsenic. But this EPA audit found that the state wasn't doing the proper review to ensure that the aquifers were not actually potential drinking water sources. So the result was a total mess. Regulators attempted to shut down high-priority wells near high-priority aquifers, but the effort to review thousands of other wastewater wells simply overwhelmed the staff resources. A bad system had been allowed to flourish for far too long. California is now moving forward, imposing stronger standards for oil field injection, but we can't go back and fix past mistakes. We should learn a valuable lesson from this. Look, if we don't drill for oil, it's not the end of the world. That oil will still be there in the future if someday we need it. But if we end up contaminating groundwater aquifers, we may well have polluted that aquifer and lost it forever. So, Dr. DiGiulio, can you expand on your comments in your written testimony on how climate change magnifies the importance of protecting fresh and brackish groundwater resources, especially in a state like California that has faced droughts and water shortages in recent years, and I note in many years, groundwater is 40% of the water supply in California.
Yes, thank you. The 2012-2016 drought in California was the worst drought in that area of the country in the last 1,200 years. What essentially happens during droughts is that groundwater is used to supplement freshwater resources. The problem with climate change is that with increased temperatures, you have increased evapotranspiration, so the soils dry out faster. In a future where we have consistent higher temperatures, it's not going to take much of a deficit in precipitation to cause a sustained drought. If you have sustained droughts and you're depending on groundwater, both fresh and brackish water, for both public water supply and for agricultural water supply, what you have is essentially a problem of constantly depleting groundwater resources. Recent research has shown in the state of California, in the Central Valley, during the 2012-2016 drought, there was substantial dewatering of groundwater resources in the Central Valley, and that has not yet recharged to full capacity. So if you have a future with continued sustained droughts, continued enhanced evapotranspiration, you have a situation where when you really need that water in the future, you won't be able to draw on that water supply.
We're also discovering in many parts of the country plumes of contamination, sometimes from industrial activities, whether it's perchlorate or PFAS, that occurred years, even decades ago. And so I want to ask you, when it comes to, you mentioned in your written testimony that since the 1950s, over 54 billion gallons of produced water has been disposed of in unlined ponds in California. Do we even know what is in that stuff?
We have a general idea. Typically, with the saline water that's disposed in these unlined produced water ponds, it's fairly salty. It's greater than 10,000 milligram per liter. TDS, total dissolved solids, has volatile organic compounds such as benzene, which is known human carcinogen, has radionuclides like radium, which is also a known human carcinogen. There's a whole series of compounds that we know about. The problem with oil and gas wastewater is that there's a large number of compounds that we cannot identify. We don't know the toxicological properties of those compounds. But we know enough that in terms of all the various compounds that are disposed in produced water ponds, that they do present a substantial risk to groundwater resources.
Thank you, Doctor. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I recognize Representative Hearn for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Leader Gosar, and our witnesses for being here today to testify on the oil and gas development and potential effects on water pollution. As a member from Oklahoma, I'm aware of the environmental concerns that some of my colleagues across the aisle will raise about water quality and how that relates to the oil and gas industry. However, I'm also aware that in recent years, states like Oklahoma and Texas have been extremely proactive in updating regulations and have greatly enforced existing environmental protections surrounding water quality. I feel that we should commend these states on their ability to work together to address environmental safety concerns by utilizing and sharing the latest technology and implementing regulations that best suit the needs of each state. My first question, Mr. Tintera, as someone who has served as the Executive Director of the Railroad Commission of Texas, the oil and gas regulatory authority of the state of Texas, you have firsthand experience in this work. Therefore, you are very familiar with the state's ability to ensure protection of water quality, something Texas and Oklahoma have done extremely well. Could you please elaborate on Texas' success and describe how states like Texas have done such a great job battling water contamination issues?
Several rules apply, and they begin with, before you even drill the well, you have to receive a drilling permit from the state of Texas. Site-specific characterizations are taken into consideration of what is the depth of fresh water, and special steel pipe and special cement is put in there to case off that and protect that fresh water from any of the drilling activities or any of the subsequent production activities. Then when you complete the well, additional strings of steel pipe are placed all the way to TD, and those are cemented off, and so that there's multiple layers of steel and cement between the fresh water to protect it during hydraulic fracturing, as well as any production activities. Railroad Commission has updated its regulations in statewide Rule 13 to specifically address hydraulic fracturing, and recognizing that shallow hydraulic fracturing may pose more risk than deeper hydraulic fracturing. By far the vast majority, if not all of the hydraulic fracturing in Texas is 1 to 2 miles deep in the subsurface, far removed from any source of fresh water. But if somebody did want to hydraulically frack within 1,000 feet of fresh water, they would have to get special consideration, special notice, put together special plans for doing that. The other issue is how is the waste handled? Texas has probably the largest underground injection control program in the world. It's delegated to the state of Texas from the Environmental Protection Agency. It's been delegated since the 1980s. There is an annual audit that the EPA does. It's a public document available to anybody to see how the Railroad Commission is performing at these. Again, injection wells have special modifications, special designs, and also special reporting requirements to ensure that they meet every single requirement, that there is no leakage, and they have pressure and mechanical integrity tests that are repeatedly done. The final one is how would waste be handled as you try to take it from where it's originated to transport it and then take it to the place where it's disposed of, and in between perhaps doing recycling. Texas regulations address that. To handle oil field waste, to generate oil field waste, you must be bonded. You must be licensed by the Railroad Commission of Texas. Your leases are subject to the hundreds of inspectors that can come at any time, at any moment, without any notice to inspect your facility and what you're doing. The trucks or pipelines that transport the water from the lease to the disposal facilities are also licensed by the Railroad Commission. Their permits require them not to leak. They would have to report any leakage that would occur, and again, there are inspectors to verify this happens. Injection wells and injection facilities are also critical. Those are regularly inspected, have monthly reporting requirements for the state of Texas. Finally, the Railroad Commission of Texas has focused on trying to encourage recycling, because we recognize that fresh water that can be used in hydraulic fracturing is a finite and competitive resource. And while it's estimated that hydraulic fracturing only uses about 1% of the industrial demand of fresh water in the state of Texas, that 1% matters, and it matters a great deal. So the Railroad Commission has carefully crafted regulations for recycling that encourage recycling and reuse within the oil field, so outside fresh water access is not necessary.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Peterson, I don't think there's any question, regardless of what side of the aisle we're on, what happened to you in the 90s is totally unacceptable. As it relates to what's happened in Texas, and you've described the policies that you work with in trying to find the right balance of being able to produce oil and gas in the state of Texas and protect landowners' rights, could you explain to us or help us out understand how landowners are treated and who is responsible for cleaning up spills and how other incidents on private property might be rectified?
Is that directed to me, sir?
Yes, sir.
The Railroad Commission of Texas, State of Texas, statutes of Texas do not hold an innocent landowner liable for the oil field activities. The statutes are carefully written. They hold the responsible party accountable for any pollution activities that might be occurring through there. The Railroad Commission of Texas inspectors focus on that violations. We also have a robust complaint system built in where anybody with a complaint can call in. We'll have an inspector go out to the site. They'll investigate the site, document what they see, and report back to the landowner and initiate enforcement action if it's possible. I think transparency is really important here. And the state of Texas has taken great strides in public transparency. They've just put on their webpage the ability to research by lease, Railroad Commission inspections that are being conducted by state inspectors so people can see what is happening throughout there. But finally, there's an aspect that I think has served the state well, and that is there's a safety net. The oil and gas industry is taxed through various permit fees to contribute to the oil field cleanup fund. And that oil field cleanup fund is there to plug orphaned wells or to help clean up abandoned sites that otherwise might not have a responsible party. And in
Just
this,
summarize in one sentence, we're well over.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging us in the response. Mr. Tintera, thank you so much. Appreciate your vast knowledge and what the state of Texas is doing to allow and protect water rights and property rights as well. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your indulgence.
Thank you. Now I'd like to ask a question to all the witnesses, and I just want a quick yes or no answer. Are state laws and regulations that are developed, are they enforced by state regulatory agencies enough to adequately protect our groundwater and also our surface water resources from the impacts of oil and gas development? Are they the ones that are they developed enough, and are they enforced enough to protect our groundwater and our surface water? First, I'll start right across. Doctor?
No.
No.
They are not. Mr. Peterson?
No, sir.
That's a no. Ms. Collins?
No.
No. Mr. Tintera?
Yes.
Yes. So now I'm just want to ask the three of you that said no. So what's falling short? Are the state regulations too weak? Are there not enough resources to enforce the regulations? Is it a little bit of both? Or is it something else entirely? What's going on? Why are they not effective to you, in your point of view? We'll start across with Dr. Giglio.
Yes, in responding to that question, there's a lot of variability between states. If you take, for instance, definitions of protected groundwater, the state of Oklahoma, they do protect groundwater during well stimulation equivalent to an underground source of drinking water. In the state of Texas, that is not the case. Definition of protected groundwater in the state of Texas is 3,000 part per million TDS, total dissolved solids. So protected groundwater in the state of Texas is not equivalent to an underground source of drinking water, not equivalent to which you would have protection under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It also is variable how the states enforce our regulation. Of course, not all states have adequate regulation, but a major problem is that the existing regulations are not fully enforced.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson, how, you said no, where is the problem?
In the state of North Dakota, we feel we have adequate regulations, but they are not being enforced. The greatest regulations in the world mean nothing if they're not enforced. I guess our regulators wear two hats. They're promoters and regulators, and they seem to give way to the industry. We have people that come to work in North Dakota. My son-in-law is in the oil business, and they say, if you don't want regulations to get in your way, come to North Dakota.
Thank you. Ms. Collins?
I agree with what's been said, but I also think the under-resourced part of state and local jurisdiction enforcement is a major component. So we don't see enough investigation happening. We don't see pre-authorization site-specific geologic investigations happening. The governments that are dealing with, especially management of wastewater from shale gas operations, certainly don't have the expertise to deal with it. So.
I want to follow up, Ms. Collins, about the regulatory process. In 2005, the Congress exempted all chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing other than diesel from regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act. What have been the impacts of all of this exemption, and should Congress restore EPA's ability to regulate fracking under the Safe Drinking Water Act?
I really think that Congress should restore EPA's ability to regulate hydraulic fracturing under the Safe Drinking Water Act. On a note about the other than diesel component of what you just said, I don't even see states requiring enough information from hydraulic fracturing companies to determine if they're actually using diesel in their hydraulic fracturing operations, which would require a Safe Drinking Water Act permit. Or a UIC permit, I should say, an underground injection control permit. So I don't see them even asking about the use of diesel in their hydraulic fracturing operations to make that determination. So it becomes very difficult with the exemption in place to determine what's in and what's out.
Okay.
Otherwise, yes, a federal floor requiring the same investigation of site-specific geology for faults, old abandoned wells, other fractures, and even computer modeling of environmental impacts. That kind of thing could be required. And in fact, what Mr. Tintera described, the kind of process that he described happening in Texas, I think all of us would be comfortable if that was a federal floor. And that's what removing the exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act would accomplish.
Thank you. Then I'll just ask, just quickly, Dr. DiGiulio, do you think that EPA should be regulating fracking under the Safe Drinking Water Act?
I do believe that EPA should regulate hydraulic fracturing under the Safe Drinking Water Act. In terms of direct impact to groundwater resources as a result of exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act, there's basically two types of formations that are specifically vulnerable. One is coal bed methane. Usually with CBM or with coal bed methane, there's fairly thin layers of coal resources. It's really difficult or almost impossible to do hydraulic fracturing and not impact groundwater resources. The second type of vulnerable resource is tight gas or tight oil. In those geologic formations, typically, especially those that are formed under freshwater fluvial conditions or formed under a river type of a condition in geologic time.
Can you just summarize? I apologize.
Yeah. Basically, those types of formations are the most vulnerable, and I think that's where we have to spend the most attention, and those types of formations are not protected with exemption of the Safe Drinking Water Act.
Thank you. I yield back, and I recognize now Mr. Westerman for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Gosar, and to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Peterson, especially the testimony you gave. I mean, that's what you describe as unacceptable. And if you went through your testimony, I reflected back to the oil and gas production in my state, and what you're talking about sounds like something from half century ago or longer. The stories that you hear, basically when I think people didn't know any better about what was in the production water. But I can tell you, I've visited several drilling rigs and visited with a lot of producers in my district, and I don't think what you've described is happening, at least in Arkansas, with our Oil and Gas Commission and the regulatory framework that we have there. I've even asked some people I know in the business, do we keep up with the produced water that comes out of the ground in Arkansas? And the response I got was absolutely, that we know exactly how much comes out, what happens to it, where it goes afterwards. And Mr. Tintera, we've heard this testimony that the produced water is not reliably tracked, with the implication that untreated produced water could contaminate viable water resources. I don't believe that's true in my state, and I wanted to get you again to tell me, is Texas able to track its produced water, and how can you be sure that you're tracking the produced water in Texas?
Texas does track its produced water, and it does so in several ways. As I mentioned earlier, you have to be licensed in order to handle and originate the produced water and produce it, and you have to keep records of that. When you transport that produced water, it has to be through a licensed entity. They have to have run tickets or manifests that indicate that they're carrying that water, and it's not allowed to spill or to leak. When it goes to a disposal facility, again, that water there is tracked. How much gets disposed of and where it came from and who brought it to that facility, and those run tickets are required to be kept and are available for audit to the Railroad Commission.
And we have another unique natural resource in my district. We actually have brine wells where the wells are put in just to produce brine to extract many valuable chemicals out of it. You know, the next closest place on the planet to having the concentration of brine like what we have in Arkansas is in the Dead Sea. So in the brine that we get in some of this produced water, it has some very valuable elements in it. You know, lithium, which all of our smartphones, electric cars are very dependent upon lithium in batteries. And we're finding that this produced water is actually becoming a valuable commodity that can be further processed to extract more elements out of it and actually produce water that's at drinking level or better standards after that water's been treated. And I wanted you, Mr. Quintero, to elaborate a little bit more on how produced water can be reused or recycled both within and outside the oil fields, and what are some of the benefits of reuse?
Yes, sir. This is an exciting technology that's been developing, and frankly, the Permian Basin in Texas has been leading the way on that. There's been a new management concept called midstream water management, which is focused on being able to attract water, gather the water together, dispose of it correctly, but also to recycle it for reuse inside of the oil field. There are new technologies that are currently under consideration that do extract valuable rare minerals from produced water, and Texas is seeing requests coming in for pilot projects and other ways to reuse produced water outside of the oil field. However, currently, there are none, to my knowledge, discharge permits from the federal government to the state of Texas to discharge water. So if you were in Texas right now and you sought a permit to discharge treated produced water, you would have to get two permits. You'd have to get one from the federal government, and you'd also have to get one from the state government. That leads to the comment that I'd like to make that we believe federal delegations to the state are a good thing. It has worked well in the underground congestion control program. The audits that the EPA does is very well. We think it would work well with NPDES programs. Be one-stop shopping and allow Texas to regulate Texas.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Congressman Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal. I appreciate that our subcommittee continues to address the negative impacts of fossil fuel extraction. We've discussed in recent hearings how offshore oil and gas development harms coastal communities like those in my district in Southern California. We've also heard about how the greenhouse gas emissions associated with continued fossil fuel consumption can hurt public health, the environment, and our children's future. I'm pleased that we're now discussing water quality impacts, which is an issue that is important to many communities across the nation, certainly important to us in California. I want to thank you to our witnesses for all of your insight and your expertise in your written testimony as well. Dr. DiGiulio, as you outlined in your written testimony, there are 541 active and 509 inactive unlined produced water ponds in California, many of which lie in the southern portion of the San Joaquin Valley. Can you discuss how the storage of produced water in unlined pits can impact surface and groundwater, and what steps we should take at the federal level as well as at the state level to better protect drinking water resources from wastewater storage?
Yes, thank you. Currently, the vast majority of produced water disposed in unlined produced water pits is saline, so it's very salty. Something like 96 to 98% of that water is fairly salty. The purpose of produced water ponds or pits is to percolate that water to the groundwater or to subsurface media. So the intent is to basically get rid of it by letting it go to the subsurface. So that's a direct pathway for groundwater contamination. The concern there is that there's been in very large volume, in the San Joaquin Valley, approximately 1 billion gallons per year is disposed into these pits. At one facility, the McKittrick 1 and 1-3 facility, 54 billion gallons have been disposed over a 60-year period. So cumulatively, over the past 60, 70 years, there's been an enormous volume of this saline produced water containing various levels of toxins going directly to the groundwater in the southern San Joaquin Valley.
Following up on that, Dr. DiGiulio, oil and gas leasing on public land in California has been on hold since 2013 due to a federal court finding the Bureau of Land Management's environmental analysis of fracking in the state was insufficient. However, within the last month, as I'm sure you're aware, BLM has taken actions that could lead to oil and gas development across more than 2 million acres of public and private land in California. So my question for you, Doctor, is will opening up more land to development, which will include both fracking and storage and disposal of wastewater, increase the risks to underground sources of drinking water in California?
Yes, I think the answer to that question is yes, because with the rescission of the BLM rule on hydraulic fracturing essentially removed protection of groundwater resources. So if that BLM rule was currently in effect, you would not be able to do hydraulic fracturing in formations containing groundwater resources having total dissolved solids less than 10,000 part per million. So with that rescission of that current rescission of that rule, it definitely weakens protection of groundwater resources. It also depends on well integrity, which also the BLM rule, which was rescinded, had much stronger safeguards for well integrity. And of course, it gets back to what you do with the produced water. The state of California produces an enormous volume of produced water. So if the water from that oil and gas development goes to these unlined pits, that causes a further problem. But the BLM rule, if it was not rescinded, would have provided a great deal more protection.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Collins, I wanted to turn to you for just a moment. What do you think is wrong with the current reactive approach to allegations of groundwater contamination from oil and gas development? And what would be a better model for regulating the industry and reducing the likelihood of impacts to groundwater and surface water?
Well, the current reactive approach is one where tort lawyers essentially are left to litigate these claims about groundwater contamination, which is never a good scenario. So instead, I'd like to see a proactive approach where we're investigating the potential for these problems to happen prior to issuing any kind of authorization to fracture. So the rules that we've already been talking about, including a practical federal floor, would help us conduct the kind of investigation that would be required and predictive modeling of environmental impacts to determine if something could affect underground sources of drinking water. It could also help us if we included things like pressure testing rules that required ongoing monitoring to determine ongoing possibilities for impact. So that's the kind of proactive approach I'd like to see and that we haven't seen in the cases that we've been litigating.
Thank you, Ms. Collins. I'll yield back.
Thank you, and now I recognize the ranking member Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2004, the EPA released a report stating that the federal regulation was unnecessary in the regulation of hydraulic fracturing, except in very specific cases involving the use of diesel fuel because the threat was so minuscule. In fact, there was a host of reputable studies by government agencies and academic institutions coupled with empiric evidence that firmly conclude that hydraulic fracturing is not a threat to drinking water resources. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit to this list of studies for the record.
So ordered.
I thank you very, very much. Now, Mr. Tintera, in the testimony, we heard, at least I heard, Dr. DiGiulio making a lot of assertions, could, maybe, a lot of things that are not scientifically based. Did you hear the same thing that I did in his testimony? Okay. Well, why I want to come back to you, Mr. Tintera, is that Texas is very special because you can actually follow these wells from the infancy to its terminal aspect. Is that true?
That is correct.
So you have a very vibrant history in regards to fracking.
Yes.
Now, what kind of issues would you see from a top-down federal bureaucracy if it was imposed upon you? How would you see that interacting and causing problems for you in Texas?
Well, first of all, it would be duplicative. Texas already has prevention in place to make sure that individual wells are designed to protect that water. Texas already has ongoing monitoring of the well bores. It's through statewide Rule 17, Braden head pressure. So you can tell, an inspector can tell at the surface if there's any disruption in the subsurface. Texas has a hydrofracturing rule that requires that any upset in pressure during the hydrofracture operations means an operator must stop activities and notify the Railroad Commission and can't continue until those activities have been repaired. It has certainly response and inspector capabilities that I've already talked about. It has a special safety net for a cleanup fund and protects innocent landowners from it. And of course, it has a transparent enforcement process. With all those in place, I think that it would be duplicative, and frankly, it would be extremely difficult with the hundreds of inspectors that exist in Texas for a federal government to put anything in place that would supersede that or do a better job.
So, Mr. Tintero, being nimble and being able to respond, is it better locally, or is it more beneficial to the federal at the federal level?
The Texas model is to definitely have it be local and intentionally places its inspectors as close to the oil fields as possible, because the oil fields operate 24/7 and regulators must be available 24/7 also.
Yeah, so empowering states and holding states accountable.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I mean, I look at, the Deepwater Horizon. Part of the problem was federal investigators overviewing it. I look at the Flint catastrophe. EPA is not nimble enough to even solve a problem of that magnitude. I look at the blowout in Colorado and that mine spill. All problems in regards to federal jurisdiction. So the local aspects are much more nimble at getting this and holding people accountable. Jurisdiction of subsurface water, is it relegated to the federal government or to the states?
Subsurface water in the state of Texas is privately owned. The jurisdictions are delegated to the state of Texas when it comes to oil field injection from the federal government.
Gotcha. Ms. Collins, have you been a benefactor of any sue and settle?
I'm sorry, have I been a benefactor?
You've been a
of what?
benefactor to any sue and settle?
Any sue and settle? No.
Okay. Have you, as a nonprofit, taken any outside foreign money?
No.
Okay, just question. And we saw a lot of complaints in government oversight in regards to lawsuits in regards to influence by Russia. So from that standpoint. Mr. Tintera, what would be the number one thing that you would look at as, we've heard a lot of discussion in regards to how each state has different rules and maybe applicability. What would be your number one thing that you could tell us states that's been the success story in Texas?
Currently, I would say public transparency and accountability of the regulators. You simply can't replace that sort of trust that the public needs to have in the regulators, and I believe that Texas regulators strive every day to try to match that, as do the elected officials in Texas. Texas regulators are elected, statewide elected. They are accountable to the voters. I think communication among peers is also very important. I'd like to see more cooperation, not less cooperation among states and the federal government. We have the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Committee. We have the Groundwater Protection Council, a lot of forums available to share information. They can share white papers. Environmental Protection Agency yesterday released a draft of their white paper on produced water. All of these dialogues are good things. All of these dialogues are important.
I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Thank you. And I now recognize Representative Cunningham for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I'm sure all of my colleagues here are aware of, I am adamantly opposed to offshore drilling off the coast of South Carolina. Offshore oil and gas could jeopardize our magnificent beaches there. The tourism industry, which brings in about $23 billion a year, our recreational industries, and everything that our constituents rely upon. And today we're discussing the need to protect communities across the country from some of the harmful effects of onshore oil and gas development, with a specific focus on how oil and gas development can impact groundwater, surface water, and land. Mr. Peterson, I found your testimony to be compelling and in some ways a message of caution to the committee about how landowners and business owners, in your case a farmer, can be impacted by spills that result from oil and gas development. And you stated that over the past 25 years, there have been over a dozen significant brine spills on your farm that have damaged your crops and your property value. And furthermore, many of the oil companies responsible either did not report the brine spills or have failed to take responsibility. Like you, Mr. Peterson, I support responsible energy development. And the key word there is responsible. It doesn't sound like the oil companies that have operated on your land have been responsible, and I fear that drilling off South Carolina's coast or Florida's or anywhere else along the eastern seaboard would be just as reckless. And so my question, Mr. Peterson, to you, if you could go back 30 years or so, a time before you leased some of your farmlands to oil and gas companies, knowing what you know now as you sit here today, and how your farm and your family's been exposed, would you do the same thing over again?
Thank you for the question. I would have to think very carefully and do a lot more research as to what the potential damage could come to me. I would be very hesitant to do that again. Not only are we under the potential damage from the well itself, but all of the right-of-way opportunities they have to put pipelines, and each one of those creates an individual liability to our land. But I do want to stress that I believe that oil production can be done right and needs to be done right. I've heard about transparency. I think that's a very important part of what we need to see take place. And so it's a very difficult question to answer. I do recognize the benefits that it comes to our state, but I think that we need to be, our regulators need to take a more prominent role in holding oil companies accountable. We seem, the attitude in North Dakota is we want to catch up with Texas. We want to, we don't want to stand in the way of good oil production. We want to, so it's a little bit of a gold rush atmosphere, and we overlook some of the real potential harms. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you for that response, Mr. Peterson. And Ms. Collins, for you, I want to follow up on Mr. Peterson's response with a question. Another reason my constituents in South Carolina are opposed to offshore oil and gas development is because of all the onshore infrastructure, the extensive footprint that would be required and impacts that would have onshore, especially pipelines. Can you discuss some of the ways pipelines can rupture or impact local communities, and what actions are necessary at the federal level to improve the safety of onshore infrastructure for oil and gas?
So pipelines through the jurisdictions that we handle have often been the subject from a water resources standpoint of blowouts. So again, site-specific geologic investigation could help determine where there could be impacts from pipeline development. We've seen ponds contaminated with drilling fluids when pipelines are going underground and going under water resources. We have seen literally explosions of pipelines. So all of this could be improved by better oversight and inspections in our experience. And a lot of it, we haven't litigated any of these cases, but we've seen other entities litigating cases around erosion and sedimentation control. There are literally thousands of miles of streams that we're thinking about crossing by these pipelines, not just one stream at a time that's being considered in a single proposal. So there's the potential for massive impacts from a single pipeline being developed, and looking at the environmental impact of the entire project at once is something that we have seen lacking.
I appreciate that, Ms. Collins. Thank you, and thank you to all four of you for coming and testify today. I yield back.
Thank you, and I now recognize Representative Lamborn for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And when I was chairman of this subcommittee, you may remember, we brought in Sally. We brought in Sally Jewell, who was then the Secretary of the Interior under Barack Obama. And she was sitting right there, and in response to my question, She said fracking is safe. If done correctly, fracking is safe. And I thought that that was good coming from a Democrat-appointed Secretary of the Interior, who is also a geologist. I believe that was her background, and knew all sides of the issue. Okay, Mr. Tintiero, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the use of water after a fracking operation has been conducted. Can produced water be reused or recycled both within or without of the oil fields?
Legally, it can be both within and without. However, the permitting scheme that exists is that it is permitted by rule with state agency oversight for relative ease to be used within the oil field, to go back down a well for and replace other alternatives. It requires a significantly higher permitting burden for it to be used outside of the oil field. It requires special commercial permits, special commercial facilities, and currently the regulatory framework on the federal level simply is not issuing any permits for use of produced water that would be discharged. However, the technology exists, and I believe pilot projects will be coming in the near future.
And as this becomes more online, more a standard practice, what are the benefits of the reuse of this treated water?
Well, the first benefit is, of course, you're using less fresh water, and in an arid state like Texas, that can be a very critical thing. Right now, our reservoirs are full. We're very blessed for that, but we don't expect that to last forever. You're going to see variations in that. And so the less fresh water that the oil and gas industry needs to obtain from the ground or from the surface, and the more it can reuse it, the less it's going to be using other fresh water. In that regard, though, we also see the ability to use it for irrigation of non-edible crops. I know of at least one pilot project in Texas for doing that. I think it was cotton is what they were testing it with Texas A&M University. I think there's opportunities for more pilot projects, and I believe that the regulatory and framework would encourage these pilot projects to help build the knowledge base so it can move forward.
Okay, and then the last question on this topic, how can we determine whether the produced water that has been treated is safe for reuse?
That is determined by the permit. And it's one thing to have the actual statutory authority to take produced water and reuse it, but it would require a site-by-site, case-by-case, very site-specific permit to be issued for any type of reuse for there. It would have to be, what is the receiving body, what is the characteristics of the produced water, because not all produced water is the same. Not all produced water comes from hydraulic fracturing. There's variations in it, and so that would be a determination based on permit by permit, and we think those permits would be best issued by the state. State is more transparent. We think the citizens have better access to state agencies and state agencies' information and can participate easier in the state permitting process than it might in the federal process.
And I would add one point to that, and that is that states know their own geology best of all. They know it better than, frankly, the bureaucrats sitting in Washington who have to look at 50 states. You know, they know their geology better. They know their hydrology better. Shifting gears, I'd like to ask about seismic events. Opponents have said that fracking is linked to what I consider minor seismic events. Has Texas addressed this issue, and if so, how?
Texas has addressed this issue, and the state legislature and state regulators have used a three-step process to address this issue. First of all, they have funded the Bureau of Economic Geology with the University of Texas in Austin to put into place a state seismic array called TexNet that's monitored by the academics. This is public information, and it's available to anybody that wants to go on the website. It's real-time information on all the seismic activity that is occurring across the state. The second thing is that the regulators have required this information to be used in any permitting activities for injection wells that are going to be going or occurring in the state. You have to go in and within a 100-mile radius, square mile radius of the injection well bore, you have to identify if there's been any historic seismic activity, and if you have, then the regulators can ask for significant more information as they're looking at providing an injection permit. The third is, how do you respond if there is an incident, and the regulators in Texas have full authority to move out, shut in any wells that are necessary, conduct any evaluations, terminate permits if that's necessary in order to react to it.
Thank you. And before I finish, I'm going to conclude by saying Colorado is very responsive to the citizens, just like it sounds like Texas is. If you think there's a fracking operation that has affected your groundwater, you call the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. They'll test your well water the same day. Or if you call them at the end of the day, they'll do it the next day. That's the kind of responsiveness that I don't think we can expect from a federal bureaucracy, but we see that as one of the benefits of state control of this area. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And before we bring this hearing to a close, I want to thank all the witnesses, but I'd like to ask the witnesses one last question. What is the one question that you were not asked today that you wish you were asked? And you have 1 minute to respond to what the answer is. So in 1 minute, what would you have liked us to have asked you? And how would you have answered it? Let's start right on our left.
I think the one question was the statements that there's been no documented cases of groundwater contamination due to hydraulic fracturing. I think it's really important to distinguish between a domestic well investigation and a groundwater investigation. The vast majority, almost all investigations due to hydraulic fracturing have been with domestic well investigations, which are typically very shallow, less than 500 feet. With our research, we have been focused on is groundwater resources, which are typically much deeper. At the Pavilion site was one of the few investigations in the country that looked at deeper groundwater resources. And what we found at that investigation and in subsequent research is that there is a very strong potential. In fact, at the Pavilion site, groundwater resources were in fact impacted from hydraulic fracturing. And with the 2004 EPA report that was focused on coal bed methane development, the EPA concluded that impact was likely, that injection of stimulation fluids during coal bed methane development into USDWs does occur, but they concluded, which is really important, that there wouldn't be impact to people's water wells. They did not conclude that there would not be impact to deeper groundwater resources.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson, what's the one question we didn't ask that you wish we had, and how would you have answered it?
The question that I would have liked to ask is, after the one-time harvest of oil is over in a agriculture community, what are the impacts? What will be left? Are we going to leave to our children and grandchildren if we don't do it in the most responsible way? I guess I think we should be careful that the energy industry does not support damage, do permanent damage to our agriculture industry.
Ms. Collins.
Chairman, I agree that states know their geology best, and I agree that states are the best implementers of the Safe Drinking Water Act and UIC permitting. However, not every state has gotten to the place that Texas has and Pennsylvania has, where they have learned by fire how to deal with shale gas development, and they've improved their regulations over time. That's why we need a federal floor to ensure that the feds are allowing states to implement programs that have a minimum of protection for any kind of activity that would potentially harm underground sources of drinking water. So it's not that I think the feds should take over. I think the feds should establish a floor that the states implement, just like we do for Clean Water Act permits. In Texas, the Texas Water Resources Code, if memory serves me, is the implementation mechanism for that statute. Same with drinking water.
Thank you. And Mr. Tintera, you can conclude. What one question would you have liked to have been asked?
What is the heavy hand of the state to...
Do you have your microphone on?
What is the heavy hand of the state that can halt repeated malpractices by an operator? I think state regulators need to have that authority, and in Texas they have that authority. Senate Bill 635 allows the Railroad Commission to refer recalcitrant oil and gas operators that don't pay their fines and don't clean up their pollution to the Attorney General of Texas, and he can remove their ability to get an operating license in in the state of Texas and allow them or disallow them to serve on boards of other oil and gas companies. It's a very heavy hand, and it's one of the enforcement tools that I think is important.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank Dr. DeGallo. It's hard for us to say this, right? I want to thank
Lots
you
of
for your-
vowels.
I want to thank you for your kind comments about Oklahoma's work in protecting its water. I really appreciate that very much. And I'll relay that to the folks who do it.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to thank everyone for your responses to that last question and all your valuable testimony and how you responded back and forth. I found that members asked thoughtful questions on both sides of the aisle. It was a very respectful meeting, and I think we all learned a lot. I want to, and again, thank you again, all the witnesses, and to the members of the committee. We may have some additional questions to ask the witnesses, and I'm going to ask the members to respond to those in writing. And under Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for your responses back to those, if there are any questions. If there's no further business, without objection, this committee stands adjourned.